Welcome to Strong Homes, Safe Families, our podcast where we focus on building codes and mitigation, engineering, meteorology, preparedness research, and any topic that helps us advance the disaster safety and resilience movement. My name's LeslieChapman-Henderson, and I'll be your host today. In our episode today, we're going to talk about hurricanes in the upcoming 2025 season. We're going to touch on some of the aspects of HurricaneStrong, a program we co-created with the National Hurricane Center in 2016, where we provide information and resources to those in the potential path of the storms, and we give them the information that they need. We could not have a better or more relevant or important guest than for this conversation than our guest today, and that is our National Hurricane Center Director, Dr. Michael Brennan. Welcome, Dr. Brennan.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Leslie.
Thank you. So before we dive into the topics about hurricanes in the upcoming season, could you share some background with our audience about yourself and your journey? And my favorite question for all meteorologists, how old were you when you decided you wanted to be in this profession?
Yeah, I think like most, it's pretty young, definitely in the single digits. By the time I was probably 7 or 8, I was pretty interested in weather. You think about, most meteorologists have some kind of event where they experienced as a young person that sort of pushed them into the field. And for me, in addition, I grew up in southwestern Virginia, not exactly hurricane prone area, but an area with a lot of interesting weather. But I think sort of the earliest big weather event that I recall was in November 1985. There was the remnants of a tropical storm that made landfall, actually a hurricane that made landfall on the Gulf Coast, resulted in a significant multi-day heavy rain event across much of Western Virginia and sort of caused the flood of record in the Roanoke Valley where I grew up, and my grandmother lost her home in that event. So I was about 7 when that happened. So it was a pretty impressionable age. Had always been very interested in weather. There are all sorts of weather, winter weather, severe weather, the occasional remnants of a tropical cyclone. So I think that's sort of what pushed me into to being interested in the field.
And like every other professional in your field that I've had the pleasure and honor of working with, it's a calling, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think, a lot of it goes back to how do you get information to people to help them get through events, survive events, like the events that you experienced as a kid. And, you think about what's changed since the mid 1980s. It's been a lot, in terms of meteorology, not just the science, but how we can communicate and reach people. It doesn't feel like that long ago to me because I remember it, but in terms of what we can do now compared to what we could do back then, we've come a long, long way. It's a light years difference.
Yep. So if I think about my 1985, I was living overseas on an air base where we had just enjoyed the invention of this new technology called a fax machine.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think back to 1985, it was, broadcast television with rabbit ears and radio and newspapers. And that's how people got their weather information in that era. And I always like to tell the story of, we go back to the 1990s or 1980s, say hurricanes, the forecasts weren't very good. Couldn't really tell people what the storm was going to do very well beyond maybe like a day into the future. But the information ecosystem was pretty simple. Everybody got all their information from kind of one place about weather, and it was largely by watching like local television. So everybody heard the same information at the same time from the same 2 or 3 people, and so the consistency was very, very high. But now the information's a lot better, and as we can talk about, maybe some today, is the way people consume information is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more paths, channels. That's made the communication aspect, ironically, more challenging in an era where we have a lot more good information to tell people.
Well, let's do that first then. Let's talk about that because you're right. We do an annual hurricane survey and we ask people, we always recommend more than one way to get watches and warnings and long-term information. But people tell us, we do hear people develop affinity for sometimes certain voices that are not as qualified as others. And that has become a concern when people diverge, right? You hear counsel from your favorite voice, but maybe they're not getting their raw information from the most credible source, which is the National Hurricane Center. So how do you counsel your audiences? I suspect I know, but I'd really like everyone to hear it from you, because I think it's important because of all the different channels and places and apps and pages and feeds, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everyone has a megaphone now, and that's really different than it was, say, even just like 20 years ago. We're 20 years past Katrina. Social media at that point was in its infancy. There really weren't smartphones yet. You weren't getting push alerts or watching video on your phone. But now you think about how people can get information, and we can talk about, the multiple ways you need to be able to make sure you can get warnings and things like that. But, you really have to find your trusted sources, and you want to find, when you're talking about weather, you want to hear from a meteorologist. It's like when you go to the doctor and you have a problem with your knee, you want to go see a doctor. You don't want to go see someone who just might say they know something about, medical care. So, find your trusted experts for weather information, just like you would do for any other thing that you're trying to get information about in your life. Local, we do know that in emergency situations like hurricanes, lots of people still do watch local television. And that's one good thing, is because, almost every local television station has, trained broadcast meteorologists who, we work with and we train and we communicate with, and they know how to interpret and explain the information to help guide people through those decisions. But it's not just the meteorology. It's, find your local government officials, the emergency managers, the folks who are going to tell you what you need to do to stay safe, whether it's to evacuate or recommend to put up shutters or take some other safety, preparedness information. So, follow them on social media, find ways to get official, authoritative information, whether it's through web pages or through watching television. Again, try to get that information and try to find those sources of information now, so that you're not sort of scrambling around when it's like, oh, there's a hurricane coming. Where do I find what I need to find? And you can always come to, hurricanes.gov, to the Hurricane Center's webpage. And that's going to give you sort of that big picture overview of what's going on with the storm. Where is it going? What are the big picture hazards, storm surge, wind, rainfall? Then your local National Weather Service office, you can go to weather.gov, type in your city and state or your zip code, and you can get that information that's sort of localized down to the community where you live. But, we realize that, people don't just consume information from one source. And a lot of social science tells us people want to have information from multiple sources, sort of telling them the same thing to enable, big muscle movements like an evacuation, for example. People want to get that confirmation. Yeah, this is really what I should do, or this is really what the threat is in my area. So find those trusted sources of information, your local broadcast meteorologist, your local National Weather Service office, your local government officials. That's where you're going to want to try to turn when a storm threatens.
That's perfect counsel. So let's talk about, in HurricaneStrong back in 2016, we all came together and said, wow, looking at the social science and the risk communication principles, what through the best of intentions as a community we were doing is telling people, because with hurricanes there's so many things you need to manage to make certain that things turn out well. Yeah. That our audience was telling us through our research and continues to, hey, you're overwhelming me, right? So we created HurricaneStrong to try to create buckets of message focus to help people move through a continuum, so they didn't feel like they're getting, and do this and do that and do this and do that all at once. And of course, the first area of focus for the 5 areas is safety. And together we, of course, landed on the idea of knowing your zone. And as much as we are so steeped in this, it's really important. And the reason we do our survey every year is because we have to remember how many people are starting from scratch. Yeah. They may have just moved here. Maybe they just became an adult. Maybe they didn't think there was a risk of flooding or hurricane because the inland threats are not always perceived. So let's talk about the first step for safety, and that's to know your zone. Why is that important, and what's the difference in the counsel for high wind versus water?
Yeah, it's really important to realize that most of the time that people are asked to leave their home or evacuate in the case of a hurricane, it's largely to get away from water, the storm surge threat. And that really is what drives most evacuation decisions, not all. But it's so important to understand and know if you live in a storm surge evacuation zone, because that sort of forms the basis for your entire hurricane preparedness plan. Because if you're in a zone, you might be asked to leave in some situation. So you have to be prepared to go. You have to know, where you're going to go, how you're going to get there, what you're going to take with you, how you're going to help your friends, neighbors, loved ones that might also need help. getting to a safe place. So it's really important to know what your zone is, how to quickly identify it, because that's how that information is going to be communicated to you by your local officials during a particular event. Some states have zones that are lettered, A, B, C, D. Others are numbered. Others are by, maybe by street and location relative to another landmark. So you want to know that now and understand what your risk is. Because if you don't live in a storm surge evacuation zone and your home is built to a standard that you can, shelter in place during a hurricane from, say, a wind perspective, and you're not in an otherwise flood-prone area, you can use your home as a shelter if you have shutters and you have all the things that you need to make your home safe in that regard. But if you're in a storm surge evacuation zone, there's always going to be that chance you need to leave, and you want to have that plan in place now, well ahead of the hurricane season. So that you don't have to scramble to put it together when a storm threatens. And it's also important to know that if you do have to leave, you don't always have to drive 100 miles to get to a safe place. It can be an achievable evacuation in many cases by just driving 10 or 20 miles out of that storm surge evacuation zone to the home of a friend or loved one, or to a shelter, or to an otherwise safe place.
So I've heard your colleagues, and I think you as well, say how difficult the surge aspect of a forecast related to hurricanes is.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about, I'm a family and I live in a mandatory evacuation zone, and understanding that water is the focus of stay or go versus wind. You guys have made a lot of progress on this front, but it's still a very tricky exercise. Can you talk in general about that, and where do you guys plug in? How do you help the local electeds make that call? And then where do these new forecast products fit into that?
Yeah, we're actually involved sort of in the whole process, all the way from understanding what areas are actually at risk of storm surge from the very beginning, and understanding what that risk profile looks like. We do modeling of hundreds or thousands of simulated hurricanes that then we map out the storm surge that they produce in a given area, and we come up with risk maps. So we know that the very worst case scenario of storm surge will put water in these given areas. And that's information is then used by local officials to devise evacuation zones. Because if the very worst hurricane we can come up with doesn't put water in a certain area, then you know that you're not at risk of surge in that particular location. So that can be like the dividing line. So we're involved from the very beginning, and that work is going on all the time in the hurricane season, outside of the hurricane season. That's a continual process that continues to get updated and refined to do these hurricane evacuation studies, and to help local emergency managers or state emergency managers understand, how much time does it take to move people out of these vulnerable areas, which is also a key part of that. When we get into a real storm, we're running, again, storm surge modeling, again, hundreds and hundreds of possible scenarios, because storm surge is so sensitive to very small changes in the track of the storm center, the peak winds of the storm, or the structure of the storm, how far out the tropical storm and hurricane force winds might go. So in many cases, we can't really tell the exact location that's going to get that very, very worst storm surge until maybe 6 or 12 hours prior to landfall, because just a shift in the track of the storm by 5 or 10 miles can make a huge difference in how much water occurs at a particular location. So what we provide, again, in real time to the emergency managers and to the public is, again, a risk-based information on storm surge. So we tell people what they need to plan for based on a reasonable worst case scenario, because evacuation decisions have to be made 2, 3, or more days in advance in some locations. And at that point in time, our average track forecast error might be 100 or 120 miles. So we're not going to be able to pinpoint exactly what's going to occur at a given location, but based on the risk that storm presents, we can outline areas that are at risk of life-threatening inundation from storm surge. And that may mean 3 feet or more of water above the ground level is sort of where we start to highlight those areas. And we have the ability to issue storm surge watches and warnings for those areas, and provide information to emergency managers, again, in real time, to help them make those evacuation decisions. So those products are meant to be complementary to each other. And say when we issue a storm surge warning, that's going to trigger a wireless emergency alert on smartphones for people inside that warning area. So you're going to get an immediate notification. And the idea is to issue those watches and warnings with enough lead time so that people have time to actually prepare and evacuate in advance of that hazard, before the water starts to come up, or before the tropical storm force winds arrive, which largely makes it kind of dangerous to be outside.
So I know that many of us perfect our messaging based on how well we can persuade those closest to us who may or may not be in the same field. And one of the things I've always told people is, listen, by the time you have enough certainty that you're going to know what's going to happen, it's usually too late to take all the relevant steps to be prepared. And that kind of goes into one of the other things I like to tell people is that weather is capricious. We have some findings, we have historicals, we have behavior patterns, we've seen different things happen. And then every time we think we know, it comes along and does something that maybe we don't expect. And in your field, you don't expect, but the public says, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen.
Yeah.
I think it bears discussion because I was talking to a reporter from Michigan last week, and I talked about Hurricane Milton and tornadoes. So he said, I'm sorry, I need to stop you there. You just said tornado. Can you talk a little bit about how Milton on the West Coast, tornadoes on the East Coast, and kind of how do we message around that to remind people to expect the unexpected piece? Because we see it in the research. They anchor in, this is a hurricane, it's going to hit the coast, and then the wind speeds are going to go down every mile X amount. And then, of course, with Wilma, it hits Lake Okeechobee and speeds up. How do we convey in a way that's actionable for the public that we know a lot of things, but there's some things we can't control or know?
Yeah, there's always a limit to the amount of detail and specificity we can give to people, because hurricanes, you think about the wind field, we just talked about, the hurricane it's not just a monolith. It's not just this big disc moving along. You watch it change. It changes on a time scale of minutes in terms of how the wind field changes and the thunderstorm activity. And, and people tend to think of a hurricane as, it's a line or a point. And it's not. It's a collection of hazards that can extend hundreds of miles away from the center, all of the hazards. And again, you made the point about the tornadoes in Milton. Landfalling hurricanes long been known and have almost always produce at least some number of tornadoes, primarily in these outer rain bands that can be, hundreds of miles away from the center. And that's what we saw in Milton. We saw a tremendous tornado outbreak across the southern half of the Florida peninsula. As the storm was approaching the coast, the center of Milton was approaching the coast along the west coast of Florida. But you have this, hundreds of miles wide hurricane, and those rain bands are actually over portions of South Florida up into Central Florida, and you had, fatalities from those tornadoes. And again, it's important to remind people that there's no single one word or one number or one color that's going to describe all of the hazards associated with a hurricane. It's too complex. So we have to treat the hazards individually. The storm surge, the wind, the rainfall flooding, the tornadoes, the rip currents, they all evolve in different places and different times during the storm. So one area may have a risk of tornadoes, another one doesn't. Some people have to worry about storm surge, other people don't. So again, it all comes down to understanding what the risk is in your particular area. And it can be complex because, again, you may be having flooding and tornadoes going on at the same time, or flooding and wind damage. And so how do you respond to that? And what do you do in that situation? And it can be very challenging. So it again goes down to communication. And again, the communication, and people are really concerned about what happens where their feet are at that very, very local level. And we can't be precise enough to tell you that more than maybe even a few hours in advance for a big event. And things like tornadoes are evolving on a minute by minute basis during a storm. They're much more shorter fuse. We can tell you where the risk might be, but in terms of where a tornado might occur or is actually occurring, that's going to happen at a much shorter time scale.
And I think it's good. I was doing a workshop, one of our program series, Ready Business, that we do for FEMA, includes an inland flooding workshop and a hurricane workshop. We combined one year in Tampa after Irma. And we actually had people in the workshop, businesses and others, and they said, we did all this preparation and we bought all this water, and then nothing happened. And so I said, no, wait a minute. When you wear your seatbelt and you drive to your school or home or office, are you mad that you didn't get in a car accident on the way to prove that you needed it? So these are just good behaviors that you need to adopt. But I think sometimes we come up against the post-event. It's kind of like sports, right? But one of the things I did want you to, before we leave, the surge topic and the capricious weather topic, can you explain to people why when you said that the deviation 5 to 10 miles affects the amount of water, there's another thing that can happen that has happened in Tampa Bay. And can you talk about that? Because people need to understand that's not people getting it wrong. That's just part of the mosaic of this whole complex thing called a hurricane.
Yeah, exactly. So, storm surge is really driven by the wind field of the hurricane pushing the water from the ocean or the Gulf up onto normally dry land. So it's very, very sensitive to the wind direction in addition to many other things. So you can think about Milton and Tampa Bay region last year. The variability in the track forecast that we put out for Milton was about 40 miles from north to south. It just happened to be south of Tampa Bay or north of Tampa Bay, and it makes a huge difference because if you have the center of a major hurricane make landfall, say, just over Pinellas County or just to the north, coming from the west or southwest, all the westerly winds or southwesterly winds on the south side of the eye are going to push water up into Tampa Bay, one of the most storm surge sensitive regions along the entire U.S. coastline. And that water could have gotten 5-10 feet above ground level in a case like that. And that's an area that's very sensitive. There's hundreds of thousands of people in Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, the greater Tampa Bay area at risk of that storm surge inundation. But what happened in Milton was the track ended up coming in just south of Tampa Bay. So you had offshore winds from the east or northeast pushing the water out of the Tampa Bay back into the Gulf. So it's just that matter of 10 or 20 miles one way or another makes all the difference between whether the wind's blowing onshore or offshore. And it doesn't mean that people didn't do the right thing by evacuating. They certainly did, because our forecasts aren't good enough to tell you 2 days ahead of time whether a storm is going to come just north or just south of the mouth of the Tampa Bay. That's something we can't really even determine to maybe within 12 hours, like we were talking about earlier. So because of the risk, and the storm surge historically has the potential to kill more people in a single day than any other hazard in a hurricane. And that's why there's been so much attention paid to it. You can go back to what happened in Ian and Southwest Florida, or Katrina or Camille. That hazard has to be accounted for, because you can't leave, hundreds or thousands of people in these vulnerable areas where they could or would likely drown if that storm surge were to materialize. So it's, again, you have to be thankful that it didn't happen, but know that you took the right steps to be prepared in case it did.
Exactly. And I think I've been in conferences lately, and your colleagues are speaking, we're talking about, and then talking with other folks at the conference about how to message this. And I think it becomes kind of a, here's what we do know and will know, and here's when we'll know it, but here's some things you can't possibly know. Again, going back to that, by the time you have certainty, it is going to be too late if the conditions change. So I live in Tallahassee, and we've prepared in 3 instances where it could have been so much worse. And I am not disappointed.
Yep.
We're very fortunate. We're fully prepared, house full of people, looking at all the tree heights, figuring out how close they would be or not be to the roof, whether there could be tree fall. And in those instances, telling people, let's get you out of there, because that could happen. Let's skip to and talk about this theme of expecting the unexpected, because I think there were people in Florida who evacuated to North Carolina only to experience Helene last year in a very devastating and damaging way. What exactly happened there? And are there any lessons learned that we can take away from that, other than the hurricanes will continuously surprise us despite our best science and efforts?
Yeah, I mean, Helene is the most impactful hurricane to hit the United States since Katrina, in terms of its scale of its impacts and the fatalities and the damage and just the magnitude of the destruction that occurred. And it was really a worst case scenario in multiple ways, as you had a large major hurricane moving very fast as it made landfall in Florida, and within 12 hours was up into the Carolinas with a huge push of tropical moisture, very high winds. And the meteorology of the situation evolved in such a way that it was a very dynamic or very energetic, meteorological setup that Helene moved into. And that allowed for those extreme rainfall rates. You had the interaction with the Southern Appalachians and the topography there that helped squeeze out every ounce of water that you could, and ended up in that huge area of 20 to 30 inches of rain in an area that had already received very heavy rainfall in the days before Helene, that sort of set the stage for that catastrophic flooding. And we've seen catastrophic flooding, flash flooding events play out. You can think back to Hurricane Harvey in 2017. That was over a Houston, sort of a metropolitan-sized area. You can think of the Southeast Texas, Houston area. Think of the scale at which that happened in Helene. It wasn't a community. It wasn't a county. It was the western third of a relatively large state that saw, basically unprecedented rainfall totals and a whole hydrologic system response that resulted in catastrophic flooding, thousands of debris flows and landslides, and just inundation of an entire communities. And as a result, many fatalities, tens, almost 100 fatalities just from freshwater flooding in North Carolina. And the wind impacts of Helene were catastrophic, especially across portions of Georgia and South Carolina. We had more wind fatalities in Helene than we've had from any hurricane in the United States going back at least to the 1960s. Almost 70 wind fatalities, which is dramatically higher than in most storms. And again, because of the rain, the tree canopy that was involved, almost all of those wind fatalities were due to trees falling on people in their homes or outside or in their cars. So the communication of those types of hazards is really challenging. And we don't yet have the ability to tell people, okay, we're going to have 20 to 30 inches of rain across Western North Carolina. Where is the flooding actually going to occur in terms of its physical footprint? It took us 40, 50, 60 years of investment to develop the flood mapping and risk mapping that we have for the storm surge hazard. And that's largely confined to coastal areas. But to do that for freshwater flooding from rainfall is a much larger challenge. And the Weather Service is rolling out flood inundation mapping to start to give people an idea of, say, along the French Broad River in Asheville or the Swananoa River, if we get this much rain, what areas are going to actually be flooded? So that's just starting to roll out, but there aren't yet community scale evacuation plans and evacuation zones built around that freshwater flooding risk. There certainly were evacuations that were called for, sort of on the door knocking, let's go door to door campgrounds, vulnerable areas that undoubtedly saved a lot of lives in places in Western North Carolina. But again, the scale of the event that unfolded there made it challenging to, where would you tell people to go? How do you keep them safe? There were not a lot of easy ways to move people around, and it was difficult to know exactly ahead of time where those very worst conditions were going to happen.
So I have a very dear friend who is in the model space, a PhD who's been very relevant to this whole field, who has a child in college in Western Carolina and had been to Parents Weekend the previous weekend and talking to the dean and saying, this two-state thing is looking kind of bad, and if it combines with the other. But the classes were not canceled because it just seemed to be such a black swan type of expectation of an event. And I think that, as we talked about when you spoke at our conference last year, we started talking a lot about trees. There was a time period when other modelers looked at trees as a benefit because of the drag on the wind. And we've never really kind of leaned in on that too much because we were always concerned about tree fall. And now we're talking about and looking at and we're surveying about, there's tree fall. We saw it in Michael, right? In Georgia and Florida and Bay County. But there's also the post-event wildfire risk. And so we've been to your point, I don't think we're completely there yet. We don't have but a lot of technology out there. There's going to be a time, probably be retired by then, when the tree canopy can be projected. Maybe the wildfire modeling, which is really starting to advance, can be combined with tree canopy density. I don't know, but I think, when giving counsel to individual people in my world, which is what happens, I'm sure for you too. Let's start with safety. Okay, you rule out surge evac. Then we got to talk about trees and what can fall and what's your building code, right? And how sturdy is your home, et cetera. So I think that each storm, as always, has opened up another whole realm of things to talk about, to investigate and understand, and then try to weave it into correct messaging. Not that things can't change over time. We know in the 70s, the Hurricane Center said to tape your windows. Well, that was different glass and those were different days. And we knew not to do that anymore. So what I want to do at this last section, if it's okay with you, you guys do great webinars every year for students, and I know there are future meteorologists out there, and I was wondering if we could just do like a lightning round, because then they can watch the forecast and they'll be like, I understand how that works. So we're going to do this and, run the table with these questions and see how it goes and just go from there. So question 1. What's the difference between a tropical depression, a tropical storm, and a hurricane?
Yeah, that's basically just has to do with how strong the peak winds are in the system. So a depression has maximum winds of basically less than 39 miles an hour. Tropical storm is between 39 and 73, and a hurricane over 74 miles an
hour. All right. And what does it mean when a storm is rapidly intensifying, and why is it important?
Yeah, so we define rapid intensification as an increase in the peak wind speeds of at least 35 miles per hour within a 24-hour period. And rapid intensification is important because it can really drastically change the types of hazards you can experience from a landfalling hurricane. It can, drastically increase the storm surge threat, the wind threat. The size of the storm can change during those events, and they're very challenging to forecast. So we put a lot of emphasis on improving forecasts of rapid intensification in the last few years. And it's really important too, because some of the strongest hurricanes that have hit the United States are systems that form, rapidly intensify, and then make landfall within 3 or 4 days. A storm like Helene last year, for example.
Very good. And would Dorian and Michael be included in those as well?
Yeah, Michael for sure. Yeah, Dorian. Yeah, anything that's going to get to a high-end Category 4, Category 5 intensity usually has at least one period of the rapid intensification in its lifespan.
All right. So when we hear meteorologists say the cone of uncertainty, what does that represent?
Yeah, it represents the sort of likely track of the center of the storm based on the track errors that we've made over the last 5 years. So it's just a high-scale, large-scale look at where the center of the storm might go, sort of as a big picture cover of the book type graphic. And it sort of gives you an idea of what areas are at risk of at least some impacts from the storm. But it's important to realize that a lot of those impacts, like we saw with Helene and Milton and other storms, extend well outside the cone. So it's just one small piece of information that we put out about a storm.
These are great basics, because then sometimes I think our kids and grandkids educate us, right? So we get them straight, and then they can keep us straight. All right, Cat 1 through Cat 5. What does it measure and what does it not measure?
Yeah, the category of a hurricane is only dependent on how strong the peak winds are, kind of like going back to the tropical depression, tropical storm, hurricane differentiation. So within the hurricane classification, we have 5 different categories. Category 1 is sort of at the low end of hurricane strength. Once you get to Category 3, with winds of at least 111 miles per hour, that's considered a major hurricane. And the wind damage potential increases exponentially as you go up through the categories. So by the time you get to Category 4 or 5, you can see catastrophic wind damage. But the category only tells you about the wind impacts. It's not really directly tied to how much storm surge you might get, or certainly not tied to what kind of rainfall flooding you might see, which is much more dependent on how fast the storm moves and how long it rains at a given location.
Very good. All right. This is an important one. If a resident, and again, we're talking to either the students at your webinar or somebody who's just never paid attention until they moved into the zone, why is the pressure dropping become such a big conversation? What is that about?
Well, the central pressure is just sort of the one number that gives us an idea of how strong the storm is. It kind of can go in combination with how strong the peak winds are. But, a hurricane is an area of low pressure or a cyclone. So the lower the pressure, the less air there is in the column over it, and the more air is being pulled out, and that helps the winds funnel in at a higher wind speed. So the lower the pressure, the stronger the storm, and in terms of wind, and usually in terms of its overall intensity. But it's just one small piece of the way we describe a hurricane. So it can't tell you everything about it just from one number.
All right. So moving in that conversation, what is a well-defined eye and why does it matter?
Yeah, so an eye in a hurricane is basically a clear spot that you can see in satellite imagery or radar imagery. When you get to about hurricane intensity, or maybe beyond Category 1 hurricane, certainly major hurricanes almost always have a well-defined eye. So the eye is just it's sort of a representation of the organizational structure of the storm. And when you see an eye appear in satellite imagery or radar imagery, you can basically connect that to a storm that's in an environment that supports strengthening. And it can give you an idea of how strong the storm is just by looking at the cloud pattern in the satellite imagery and how the eye looks compared to the rest of the storm. Helps us estimate how strong the storm is when we can't get an aircraft in there.
All right. So this is a big one. What is the most common misconception about hurricanes?
There probably is more than one, but I think, again, if I had to pick one, it's that the category is not indicative of the damage potential, especially from the water hazards. And the water hazards are what kill the vast, vast majority of people. I think if I had to throw in another one, I would think that there's no more danger when the storm's over. We lose a lot of people, have a lot of fatalities, a lot of accidents incur after a storm. And that sort of post-storm environment can be almost as dangerous as the environment during the storm when people are sheltering in place.
That's a great point. It's almost like we need to wait for the all clear thing that I've experienced as well. I've told my friends, please stay home.
Yeah.
Stay off the streets because people want to go out and see what happened. It's human nature, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and we're very, very grateful for your time. Is there anything else that you want us to convey either to our student audience or just our general audience that we're talking to people all the time through the HurricaneStrong initiative and other opportunities to connect? Because we still get a lot of email and we talk to a lot of people, but we also still get phone calls at the end. Famous call that is always so concerning to us is people will call us and say, do I live in a low-lying area? Because people will say, if you live in a low-lying area, do XYZ. So we always tell them, what does it look like in a normal thunderstorm? What's happening around your home, and go from there. And that's always almost a heartbreaking phone call to get if it's really close to the end. But what if, crystal ball, magic wand, what do you want everyone to know beyond what we've talked about here? And you've made some fantastic points here.
Yeah, I think just a couple other things I would say is, there's a lot of attention that gets paid to the seasonal hurricane forecast and how busy or not busy people expect the overall season to be. And it's important to remind people that really doesn't matter in terms of how you prepare or how you have to be ready for the upcoming hurricane season, because you only care about the storms that are going to affect you. And if we have 25 storms and none of them bother you, then that may be a less busy season for you than a season where we have 5 storms, but you have one of them make significant impacts to where you live. So the overall activity in the Atlantic is not an indicator of whether you should prepare or not for the hurricane season. You have to be ready every year. And we've had 25 hurricane landfalls in the United States since 2017. And it's been a very, very active period, especially along the Gulf Coast and Florida. And it's just important to remind people that, if based on recent experience and history going back very far, everybody in hurricane prone areas has to be ready every year, not just at the coast, but well inland, as we've seen in Helene and other impactful storms in recent memory.
That is a perfect note to conclude on. So we really can't thank you enough for your time and for your leadership and service to our, not just hurricane country, but the expanding area of impacts, because we all are a highly mobile world and we have family. If we're not in the strike zone, people that we care about that are. We also deeply appreciate the Hurricane Center partnership. I want to thank everybody for listening to our episode of Strong Home Safe Families. And of course, don't forget, we will have show notes with time codes so you can zero in on all the great points that Dr. Brennan made. And we'll also have links to the different things we talked about that are available online. The Hurricane Center address, of course, as a first and foremost. You can email us at info@flash.org, or you can always call us toll free at 877-221-SAFE. That's 877-221-7233. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, share, and provide us a review on iTunes. We'll talk with you next time. Thank you.